Bruno hobbled off the ferry onto dry ground. He carried a small box with his only possessions, a pencil, naturalization documents, a pair of socks, and a faded picture of his mother. He limped away from the boat, set his box on the wet ground, and sat. In the gutters, rotting food waste, horse shit, piss, and dead vermin floated in standing water. The overwhelming stench put a pause on his hunger and silenced the rattling between his meatless ribs. Bruno's mouth went dry and his tongue swelled, heaving him forward to vomit. He retched without purchase. It was morning and the city was spinning. A traffic cop failed to direct traffic. Carriages charged by with abandon. One took a corner too fast, tilting on two wheels, hopped up a curb and ran over the back legs of a dog. The dog crawled into a gutter and out of view. Outside a pub, two men with cartoonishly large hands swung at each other, delivering blow after blow, and neither fell down. Prostitutes, woozy from drink, swayed on corners looking for an early morning John. Cholera ravaged the ship 2 months into the journey. Most died. Bruno and his mother arrived at Ellis Island, hungry and dehydrated, along with 1/4 of the ship's manifest. One night, while in quarantine, he laid in bed next to her as she coughed through the night. When he awoke, there was a mist of blood on her pillow, and her eyes were open with a milky film over her once bright green eyes. She had seen death, and he had taken her. 3 months later, the nearly 14-year-old Bruno sat at the tip of America's most infamous island and shook with fear. A group of women in maroon dresses approached Bruno with a slice of bread and a paper pamphlet covered in words he didn't understand, although he did recognize the Christian cross on the first page. As one of the women spoke to him in a strange language, he unfolded the pamphlet and used it as a napkin while he ate the bread. Furious at his sacrilege, the woman pulled the pamphlet and the bread from his hands and delivered a cracking slap across his cheekbone. His ears rang, and his eyes swelled as she stormed away. Bruno held his face and clenched his teeth as he waited for his eyes to stop watering. When his vision cleared, a man stood before him. The man whistled confidently with his hands in the pockets of a fashionable khaki suit, topped with a matching hat decorated with a duck feather. The man smiled at Bruno with only his upper lip. "At last! Bruno." The stranger leaned forward and patted Bruno on the head. Bruno leaned back suspiciously. He spoke Bruno's language in an accent he couldn't recognize. His posture was unsettling, and his familiarity even more so. "Oh, you don't have to worry. Your mother made all the arrangements before she..." The man paused dramatically and looked at his dazzling, polished shoes. "Passed from this world." After spending half a year with some truly low men, Bruno had learned how to spot a confidence man from a mile away. He was one of them. "You can trust me, Bruno." He smiled, flashing innumerable large teeth. "Then tell me my mother's name," Bruno commanded in a voice comically serious for such a young man. "Eunice Schultz," the stranger responded happily, followed by a forced frown, and, "May God rest her soul." Bruno's suspicion waned and the stranger leaned forward. "I know an excellent restaurant a few blocks from here. Come, young Bruno. It's all been arranged." Slowly, Bruno rose to his feet. The stranger held a hand to help steady him, but Bruno refused. He picked up his box, saddled it under his arm, and stood facing the stranger. "Tell me your name," Bruno commanded. "You will simply love this restaurant, young Bruno. It's like nothing you've seen before. I hope you brought your appetite." The man laughed. He set out ahead of Bruno and zigzagged down the sidewalk, nearly out of sight. Bruno hobbled after him, slow to keep up, struggling under the weight of his box, his only possession. Bruno had indeed never seen such a spread of food before. He ate until he felt the food packing up to the top of his throat, and then ate more. All the while, the stranger picked on a single beef rib, eating slowly and methodically. Few words were spoken between them, and any question Bruno asked was ignored or dodged by the man. Outside the restaurant, Bruno was sluggish and exhausted from the feast. "Thank you," Bruno croaked. The stranger turned to Bruno, his face set in an unnerving grin. His cheekbones were high, smiling without his eyes. "Of course, young Bruno. I have more to show you still." Again, the stranger leapt away from Bruno, who struggled to keep up. They weaved around hurrying businessmen. Bruno couldn't help but bump into them. for his eyes were fixed on the towering buildings above. They were a few blocks away from the restaurant when Bruno stopped dead. "My box!" Bruno yelped. He turned around to head back, and the stranger didn't follow. "Come, I need it!" he shouted. The stranger didn't move. He shouted again to no response. "Curse you!" Bruno yelled at the stranger. At this, the stranger laughed like a madman. Bruno huffed and went the other way down the street, but this street was not the street he had been on just moments ago. The buildings were smaller, 2 stories tall at the most. No one walked the sidewalks, and the streets were much narrower. He could hear the clopping of a horse in the distance, but could not see it. Scared, Bruno turned back to see the stranger, and that end of the street had also changed. What moments before looked like the throbbing heart of a cosmopolis was now sparse. In the distance, the cobblestone road turned into dirt, wandering off into a country road on the horizon. The sun began retreating under the shingled roofs of the lonely storefronts. Not a single candle burned in the windows on the streets, save for a single house. Bruno approached it. Above the door was wood lettering that spelled restaurant in Bruno's language. Desperate for help, he opened the massive door. It painfully screeched on its hinges. The hallway was completely dark. It smelled like rotting newspaper. "Hello?" Bruno shouted into the darkness. His voice was muffled, as if he were surrounded on all sides by heavy curtains. Thrown into panic, he turned around to feel for the door and found nothing. He moved forward with his hands out and his heart racing. Staggering in the dark, Bruno made a step, but his foot found no floor. He hurtled forward and fell down an invisible staircase. His elbow cracked on a stair, and he screamed, only to be cut short by falling to a stop, face first on cold ground. The pain danced over him while he collected himself. When he opened his eyes, he saw a dim light coming from a crack between curtains. He limped through them and entered a dimly lit red room with velvet walls and empty tables with candles burning. On one of the tables sat his box. Bruno wobbled to the table to collect it. He sat and rested his head on the polished oak while he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the stranger. Bruno gasped. The stranger stared through him with jet-black eyes and smiled. His mouth was filled with millions of sharp teeth, row after row disappearing to the back of his mouth. "The dance!" the stranger hissed. At that, the lights went out. Through the curtains ambled out a big brown bear in a vest wearing a fez. The trained bear sat on a stool and spun the arm of a sound box. It squeaked with a rusty whine, made a chilling plucking noise like a broken piano. The curtains behind the bear waved, and out came a woman in a burlesque dress. She swayed from side to side, her face white like a doll's and eyes vacant. Bruno froze with boiling fear. It was his mother. The stranger clapped and danced, hooting and spinning to the deathly tune the bear played. Bruno tried to scream, but could not. His mother approached his table and pulled herself up, dancing and kicking. Bruno grabbed onto the bottom of her dress and screamed, "Mom! Mama!" he shouted. She didn't look down, nor did she stop dancing. "Mama! Mama, listen to me!" he shouted, pleading with the automaton. She danced and danced as the stranger spun in circles around Bruno. Bruno's box began to smolder on the table, quickly igniting in flames. It burned with tongues of fire, shooting to the ceiling, but did not consume the table nor the room. "Dance! Dance! Dance!" the stranger commanded. Bruno didn't move. "Dance," his mother croaked, staring at nothing. Bruno wept. The stranger grabbed Bruno by the armpits and set him on the table. He wrapped Bruno's arms around his mother's waist. Her dress was freezing and soaking wet. He tried to pull his hands free, but they were stuck to a noxious slime that coated her. "Dance!" the stranger screamed. He spun in circles, clapping as the bear played the sound box hypnotically. Bruno wept insanely, holding on to his mother. She spun and kicked and danced as he slid to her feet. The stranger spun in circles like a demented ballerina. Bruno's mother kicked and held up her skirt. He collapsed on the table, screaming and begging for it to end. Bruno felt fingers dig into his collarbone. He yelped and snapped his head back. There was the stranger, sneering at him with implacable menace. "Dance!" he commanded, his infinite rows of teeth glistening in his mouth. "Dance! Dance! Dance!" Bruno raised his feet and swayed with his mother while the stranger cackled. His hands began to freeze on his mother's hips, and he could not let go. They turned purple with cold, and his fingernails mutated black. The stranger clapped wildly, knocking over chairs and screaming like a madman as Bruno danced. The dance would last forever.
The